All over the Baja Peninsula, the indigenous peoples tell stories that in ancient times there was a great meeting of various nations in the north that ended in a falling out amongst them and a great war between them. In some versions, two great lords separated them into two opposing groups. The story ends with the defeated group fleeing south to the mountains and caves. Warfare and violence seem to be endemic in the peninsula, seeing how it played a large role in the oral myths and stories of these peoples. As the note, this film will look at the three main nations of the peninsula, the Cochimi, Waikura, and the Berigu. Archaeology helps support this, and gives us the earliest evidence of conflict amongst the people in the region. Skeletal remains of the Las Palmas complex, attributed to the historical Berigu people and dating as early as 1400 to 1200 BC all the way to the 1700s AD, are found with fractures that indicate trauma. One estimate puts the prevalence of trauma at 53% of Las Palmas skeletons, 59% male, and 33% female. Thus it is said that they have the highest rates of remains with traumatic injuries caused by violence in the whole of the Americas, only comparable to the remains of the Middle Horizon to late intermediate cultures in the San Pedro de Atacama region of Peru. This is all the theories postulating that there was much inter- and possibly intra-group violence with these peoples, which is backed up by the European accounts that the Berigu were in a perpetual civil war with their Waikura neighbors in the north. One example of Berigu on Berigu violence is depicted in a print by Ignacio Tirsch, a missionary in the 18th century. This print shows a Berigu man shooting arrows at a Berigu woman for apparently, quote, stealing some of his bad fruit, unquote. Yet one theory suggests otherwise, saying that the lesions, while usually not life-threatening, are a result of a mourning practice carried out by mostly females where they self-mutilate themselves. But due to the number of injuries found amongst the skeletal remains of the Berigu, it can't be as easily explained away by self-mutilation. Another account of Berigu warfare by the ethnographer Venegas helps to reinforce the prevalence of warfare amongst these peoples, which will be looked at later in the film when we look at the tactics used by the indigenous Baja Californians. The famous cave paintings of Baja California are another source that shows the prevalence of violence. The Cochimi people believed that these paintings were created by a nation of people who were tall in stature who came from the north, fleeing another group that had driven them out. They reached the peninsula and created their art, yet in the end, they were all killed both by that same group that had caught up to them, and the indigenous peoples whose land the tall people had encroached on, finding any excuse to rid themselves of them. Many of the cave painting sites of the Sierra Guadalupe great mural tradition contain images depicting violent scenes, human-like figures with arrows and or darts going through them or painted over them. While these may only signify a desire or hex, there is no doubt that they represent man-on-man violence and trauma. One interpretation of these scenes is that the overpainted arrows or darts are wounds, while those going through the figures are indicative of death. The indigenous Baja Californians use many different types of weapons, many of which survived in the archaeological record and the accounts of Europeans. The most notable is the atlatl, or spear thrower, the peninsula being one of the last places on the continent where it was still in use, at least into the 1700s according to sources. Spear throwers have been well preserved thanks to the dry climate of the region. One individual in Berigu territory, a 19-year-old, was found buried with 4 spear throwers. Another male burial contained 4 atlals, bound together with palm fibers. This may be indicative of some sort of burial ritual. Although we have taken a peek at the arsenal of weapons the Berigu have used in the film about them, we will look at theirs in more detail, and those used by other Baja Californian peoples, as it is as notable that each group's weapons were different depending on the region they were in, such as one group using bows and another using harpoons and spear throwers. The Berigu of modern Cabo San Lucas always carried bows and arrows, 1 to 2 meter long staves of hardwood that were fire hardened, and sometimes harpoons. The English privateer in 1721, George Shelvocke, also noted how this same group used bows that were 1.9 to 2.1 meters, 6 foot 3 to 11 inches in height, strung with grass cords and deer sinew. He also wrote about the length and composition of the arrows, being 1.45 meters or 4 foot 9 in length, and made with cane and 4-length feathers, 30 centimeters or a foot from the notch. It then had a hardwood dart tipped with a lithic point or a worked fishbone that was inserted into the cane. Those of La Paz carried bows, arrows, fire-hardened lances, and harpoons. The Berigu warriors were noted for grouping themselves in squadrons, led by the chief or captain, who was more experienced. They also painted their bodies in several colors and wore small feather headpieces. Their constant enemies, the Waikura, notably those of Bahia Magdalena and Bahia Santa Marina, were recorded as using bows and arrows and fire-hardened lances that were also used for fishing. Some Waikura sites also have been found with bows that were 108 to 210 centimeters, or 3 foot 7 to 6 foot 11 long. and arrows that were 173 centimeters or 5'8" in length, tipped with bone or stone. Lances with no points were also found, used in both hunting and warfare. The Cochimi arsenal was more extensive, more so amongst some groups. Due to their contact with the human groups in the north, they used similar weapons, notably short-range arms. Those of the Pacific coast made arrows from reed grass, and they also used hardwood throwing sticks flattened and shaped into a C or G shape, with its tips pointed inwards, with a circumference of 75 centimeters or 2'5" that looked like an inverted C when held up and carried. It was primarily used for hunting rabbits, but the Cochimi had a tactic of beginning a surprise attack using these throwing sticks and then finishing the enemy off with bows and arrows. The Cochimi of Bahia San Luis Gonzaga and the Bahia de Los Angeles always carried arrows and quivers, and most notably, those Cochimi north of San Luis Borgia utilized weapons not used by any other Baja Californian group, not even among other Cochimi. They attacked from a distance with bows and arrows, and then used hardwood weapons in close combat, including a mace in the form of a short staff, 18 centimeters in diameter, with a stick handle that was 18 centimeters long, a rock pick with a pick on one side, and a hatchet on the other with a proportionally long stick as a handle in the center of the head of the weapon. And they also used a short curved sword, which instead of where the hand grip should be, there was a handle in the shape of a knife with a sharp edge outwards. Lastly, the Cochimi on Isla de Cedros were armed with sharpened staves that were 2 meters long and 6 centimeters in diameter, bows and arrows made from pine, wooden maces, and stones. Those on the coast north of the island had a similar arsenal, albeit with small quote-unquote weak bows, small staves, short maces, and stones. Conflicts would arise over the control of resources when they became scarce or out of revenge, sometimes incited by a shaman or for stealing a sacred object. The offended party would go to the offenders and yell obscenities and to declare war on them, which was followed by open collecting of reeds for arrows and stone for points, all meant for intimidation. With the arrival of the Europeans, they arrived at a place rampant with violence and warfare. As was seen in the Perico film, the first Europeans to arrive on the shores of Baja California, the expedition of Fortun Jimenez in the 1530s, had many killed by the showers of arrows and darts from the Perico. Yet this also had the effect of being in contact with the indigenous Baja Californians in detailing how and why they fought their wars amongst one another. We will now go back to explaining what would happen after Baja Californian groups declared war. It is important to look at how hostility was displayed by the different nations, which was observed by the Spanish. No surprise there, as they were seen as the invaders by many indigenous peoples. The Cochimi of the Pacific coast would signify that they were in a state of hostility and war by placing pitayas with arrows through them, and or trunks of cardon cactus with branches piercing them, or broken arrows, on the sides of trails leading up to their villages. Now for the most important part, what did warfare look like in indigenous Baja California? We have already looked at the arsenal of weapons used by them, as well as the reasons conflict would arise, which as a note, would change very little post-contact. Now we will look at how they fought, what sort of tactics they used, as well as the outcomes. There are many accounts that detail the tactics used by them, and how they would go to war. Bands of warriors would convene on settlements, not arranged in any order. The Waikura signaled the beginning of their attacks with whistles. Waikura accounts of how they fought are scant, due to their bellicose nature towards the Spaniards. From what is known, however, they would paint themselves and shout and gesture at the enemy to intimidate them. They were grouped in squads led by a captain. Their main tactic was encircling the enemy in the bush. The Perico would use hit-and-run tactics, retreating back into the bush after causing enough damage. As for the Cochimi groups, those north of San Borgia attacked at dawn, fighting from a distance with bows and arrows, and using carved hardwood weapons for close combat. The Bahia San Luis Gonzaga and Bahia de Los Angeles Cochimi would yell and mock their enemy, while looking arrows to signal the rest of their group to begin an attack. When hostilities broke out on the coast north of Isla de Cedros, the Cochimi would paint themselves white and never engaged in close combat with the Spanish, instead using ranged weapons. Victory was measured by how much fear the attacker instilled in their enemies, and not by any other means, such as force or military skill. This is why vengeance was a popular motive for how conflict broke out into warfare. With the arrival of the Spanish, there were many hostile encounters, as well as attacks on them. Some Cochimi and Guaycura nations created a temporary alliance to combat them. The hit-and-run tactics were very effective against the Spanish. Therefore, they began to entrench themselves and used the technological advantage of the horse and gunpowder weapons to their fullest extent. The Spanish began to build more fortified settlements, which would be more difficult to raid, albeit at a cost. The indigenous peoples exploited that vulnerability. their logistics. However, some groups saw the advantage these newcomers could give if allied and used against their own enemies. The Spanish wrote in their accounts how the indigenous peoples would convey peace and or surrender. One account states how when the natives realized the campaign was in vain, the leader would come forward with the women and children willing to call for peace. Then they would hand over their weapons and hand over the children as hostages. Amongst many of these groups, it is common that they lay their arms to signal for peace. This has led to the concept of the Pax Jesuitica, the idea that the missionaries in the 1600s brought about peace to the peninsula, as the mission system granted the indigenous Baja Californians food security and peaceful intentions they had. However, this did not signify an end to the hostilities by the indigenous peoples. For example, the grudge between the Guaycura and Pericu still persisted, with many accounts of how both of them would fight back and forth, ambushing each other's villages. In one episode in 1633, the Pericu of La Paz were attacked in the night by a Guaycura party, which saw 30 casualties, including the wife and son of the Pericu chief. They asked for Spanish assistance to track the attackers down. They found a Guaycura village next to a waterhole and surrounded it, killing many in the skirmish and retreating under cover of arrow fire. These anti-Spanish hostilities would culminate with the Pericu Rebellion in 1734, which was explained in detail in the Pericu Nation film. To sum it up, the Pericu took advantage of the small Spanish military presence and using deceit, as well as knowing the landscape to drag out the rebellion, only put down in 1737. After this tumultuous event, accounts of violence or warfare on the peninsula by indigenous peoples decreased significantly. Explanations include disease, a realization that the Spanish were here to stay, and most importantly, their incorporation into the mission system, which meant that there was no more conflict over resources, as there was much abundance of material in these settlements. As a bonus on the subject of trophies, in a recent film on the Pachuca hair capes of the Baja Peninsula, there were some comments that said that they thought these capes represented a way to collect and display trophies from enemies. Yet, as was mentioned in the film, this was not the case. Although the only attested to human nation belong to the same linguistic group as the people of the northern Baja Peninsula are the Quechan near the mouth of the Colorado River, who would scalp their enemies and then brandish them painted with red ochre on long lances, using them almost like standards. However, in the Baja Peninsula proper, there is only one case of collecting trophies. In this case, the heads of the 5 Spaniards captured and killed from the failed Sebastian Vizcaino expedition of 1596. And as was explained in the Pachuca hair cape film, many Baja Californian peoples were noted as having an aversion to handling anything or any remains that belonged to the dead. To conclude this film, we'll look at the Pericu myth that explains why man resorts to violence and warfare. The great lord Niparaya had 3 sons. 2 of them, named Huac and Tuparan, would team up and fight against him in the heavens, and he would defeat them. The great lord hated war because his other son lived amongst man, and they would end up killing him. Niparaya did not want man to suffer the same fate as his son, to be damned to the underworld, where his 2 sons ruled, as the Pericu believed those who were killed by arrows were sent to the underworld and could not reach heaven.